Well, good afternoon, or good morning, or good middle of the night, or whenever it is you're watching this. This is the first introductory video for week 2, and I'm going to try to keep these as short and succinct as possible. I'll do my very best to do that. This lecture, or this introductory video, has to do with Mesopotamia, both its history and its art. So this week, starting with this video and the reading that it pertains to, we're moving out of prehistory and into the era of civilizations. And I'll talk in just a moment about what a civilization is. Why do we not talk about prehistorical civilizations, but we talk about Mesopotamian civilization or Egyptian civilization? We'll get to all that quite soon. But the first question is, why are we starting in the places that we're starting this week? So we'll talk about Mesopotamian religion. There'll be another video and reading about Egyptian civilization, and then sort of ancient Aegean or early Greek civilization. So why are we starting in these places? There were advanced civilizations taking place in places like India and China around the same time. So why are we not looking at those places, and yet we're looking at Mesopotamia and so on? The answer is pretty simple, and that is that for better or for worse, the humanities course at Milligan is focused on Western culture. Okay? The culture that we are products of, the culture that we continue to shape today. We do this, we focus on the West not because we think that Western culture is necessarily superior to all other cultures, such as East Asian cultures or Sub-Saharan African cultures or anything like that, but rather it's the fact that really, I think, any student at Milligan College, regardless of ethnicity or background, is profoundly shaped by Western culture. And so it's important to know, where did we get this culture from? The assumptions, the beliefs that we hold dear, the practices that we take for granted, where did that come from? And what are the roots of these things? So, so that's why we're focusing on Western culture. So one of the major goals of the course really is to help us understand, how did we get here? How do we get to this point in the 21st century where we think a certain way about politics or religion or art? We also behave in certain ways as religious people or as non-religious people, as political actors, and so on. How do we get here? So that's why we're focused on Western culture. Now, it is a bit odd, maybe in a way, that we start a course that's about Western culture in places that are generally not considered Western places, right? Mesopotamia, which is more or less modern-day Iraq, Egypt. Okay, these are places that we don't necessarily think of as being Western today. Rather, we talk about these regions as belonging to the Near East or the Middle East. So there is a certain irony involved here, certainly, that what we call Western culture today actually originates in what we would call the East. And that just goes to show that we cannot think about Western culture, even though Western culture is real, I think, and distinctive in various ways. It is not and never has been hermetically sealed from other non-Western cultures. So that's worth bearing in mind. So what we're doing, the logic of the way this course is organized, is that we're starting by looking at cultures that are going to leave a permanent impress on Western culture. That's why we are looking at the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians rather than the Indians and the Chinese, and so on. All right, well, I promised I would come back to this question of civilization. What do we mean by that term? Um, the word civilization comes from the Latin word civis, which is Civis, okay, civis, it's like civis. And in Latin, that term means city dweller, the resident of a city. So that tells us something very important. That tells us that the term civilization is tied to cities. Okay? In a very literal and real sense, to be civilized is to be citified. And this is the reason we can't talk about prehistorical civilizations, because as you already know, people who lived in the Paleolithic period, the Neolithic period, they might have lived in a kind of large village, but nothing that we would describe as a city. Some of the very first cities that we know about, they appear roughly around 3000 BC, so at the very end of the Neolithic period. And some of the very first cities that we know anything about show up in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia in particular. And one thing you want to look for as you read, especially West in the World, is the question of why cities. Okay, human beings have been around for thousands of years without cities. Why are they suddenly building cities, particularly in places like Mesopotamia? There must be some reason. So be looking for that. But let's go to the next sort of stage of development. Okay, so incipient cities are being built. As cities become more populous, as cities become more organized, something else is going to become necessary, and that is a form of communication that is bigger than just sort of oral communication, a form of communication that can reach people besides those people who are standing right in front of you. And what this leads to eventually is nothing less than the development of writing, which we, of course, absolutely take for granted, but which people existed without for a very long period of time and had to be developed, had to be invented. If you want to think about why writing might have been invented, just think for a moment about Milligan College itself. Okay, Milligan is sort of like a Neolithic settlement, right? If you add together all of the students, faculty, staff, administrators, you have what, maybe 1,500 people, something like that. So not a huge community, certainly not a city. But even in a community as small as Milligan, think of how critical writing is. Imagine trying to do what we do at Milligan if nothing could ever be written down. That I think would cause some problems. I'm not quite sure we could actually function if you start thinking about testing, if you start thinking about record keeping up with your grades and recording those and that sort of thing. So I think it's pretty easy, if you think about it that way, it's pretty easy to see why writing would become absolutely essential as soon as communities reached a certain size threshold. So when you hear the word civilization, I really want you to think about two things, two ingredients without which you don't really have civilization. And those two things are tightly connected, and they are cities and writing. Okay? It's really hard to have a large city without any kind of writing, and writing is invented largely to deal with some of the problems that arise when a large group of people are living together. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about civilization. Okay, so Mesopotamia, I think it might be helpful. I've said before, if you have your books in front of you during these lectures, that's going to help. I would encourage you to look at page 50 in Art Across Time for a nice map of Mesopotamia. You need to understand that when we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we are not talking about a country or a nation state, like we might talk about, France today, but rather we're talking about a geographical area, as I've said, that roughly corresponds with modern day Iraq, okay, more or less. Some locales in Mesopotamia are already quite familiar to you, even if you don't keep track of the news, even if you've just read the book of Genesis. You know that a fair amount of the action in Genesis, especially in those first 11 chapters, but even beyond that, takes place in Mesopotamia. So what period of time are we studying when we look at ancient Mesopotamia? We're really looking at a period from about 3,500 or 3,000, something like that, BCE to about 500 BCE. We will be BCE until well into Unit 3. So if I never specify BCE after I give you a date, you can just assume that's what it is, BCE or BC, whichever you prefer. So as I've already said, Mesopotamia is important because Mesopotamia gives rise to one of the world's earliest civilizations, and that is the civilization of ancient Sumer. Sumer is basically southern Mesopotamia. And around 3,000 or so, we see some of the world's first cities arising, like Uruk, U-R-U-K, which had about 50,000 inhabitants, which is pretty impressive by the standards of the time. What are some of the cultural achievements of the ancient Sumerians? Well, there's several, I think three really, or actually, I guess, yeah, three that I want to highlight. One I've already mentioned, and that is the creation of these cities, like Uruk. Uruk is not the only one, though. And then you have, of course, as I've already said, the invention of writing, which in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer in particular, is known as cuneiform, C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M. That's going to show up in both of your textbooks, cuneiform. Kind of a wedge-shaped writing system that would have been very difficult to learn. I mean, don't think for a moment that most ancient Sumerians were able to read and write in cuneiform. This was something that only a kind of educated elite would have been able to do. But still, the very fact that any system of writing was invented, of course, is terribly significant. As I've already indicated, the original impetus for creating writing in places like ancient Sumer was very practical. Okay? Writing was very helpful for keeping records and receipts and inventories and wills and things like that, very pragmatic kinds of things. But it won't be too long before writing is used for non-practical purposes, like the writing of literature. And you'll read a little bit about, we're not going to actually read this, but you'll read about the epic of Gilgamesh, which is a great Mesopotamian epic written in cuneiform. We'll talk more about what an epic is when we get to the Odyssey. So you've got cities, you've got cuneiform, and finally, we have to mention the ziggurats, these pyramid-like religious structures that were erected starting very early in ancient Mesopotamia and then for centuries and centuries to come. So if you have your Art Across Time book in front of you, you might want to turn to page 55 and look at the White Temple, which is in Uruk and is the earliest surviving ziggurat. So what are ziggurats? Well, that's what you've got to figure out. And I will just remind you, if you haven't looked, at the essay question for this week. You're going to submit your very first essay later this week. And the question is about ziggurats and pyramids, and I'll say more about pyramids in the Egyptian video. But what you'll need to do is be able to describe ziggurats as architecture. What did they look like? What were they made out of? That sort of thing. But also talk about their function. What were these buildings designed for? Who went in there and what did they do? And what kinds of activities went on inside the ziggurats? And I think you'll find that there are multiple kinds of activities. We as modern Western people tend to think that religion sort of has its own sphere that is separate and distinct from everything else. But ancient people didn't think that way. So without giving too much away, let me just say that ziggurats are going to have what we would consider to be religious functions, but also non-religious functions. So you've got some homework to do to work on that, but I think you'll find what you need in both of the textbooks. Okay. At this point, I'm just going to kind of continue to move chronologically as we talk about ancient Mesopotamian civilization and just hit a few of the highlights. Note some of the things that you're going to want to have a pretty firm grasp on. As we move towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC, and when I say 3rd millennium BC, I'm talking about the 2000s BC. So we get to the end of that period. We see one of the world's first empires. So, we've already got some of the world's first cities. We've got one of the world's first writing systems, some of the world's first monumental architecture in the ziggurats. Well, we also see arguably the first, or one of the first, empires in history, and that is the Akkadian Empire, Akkadian, the Akkadian Empire, which lasted from roughly 23 to 2100 BC. It's worth, I think, since we'll be talking about a number of different empires in this course, most famously the Roman Empire, it's worth pausing just for a moment and making sure we all understand what an empire is. An empire is, of course, is a political unit. It's a unit that is ruled by an emperor. But in order to qualify as an empire, something needs to have a fairly vast extent. And it needs to incorporate a number of different ethnic and language groups. This is going to be one of the challenges of holding empires together, because it's holding together peoples that can't necessarily communicate well with one another, that don't necessarily share all the same cultural assumptions, and so on. The most illustrious Akkadian emperor was this figure named Sargon, and he's definitely someone worth knowing something about. You can see a bust, or at least his head, on Art Across Time, page 62. So you want to know something about him, and also his daughter Enheduanna, who's a very interesting character in her own right. You'll find some material on her in West in the World. And since I mentioned Enheduanna, I'll just remind you that you're going to want to be able to say something about the place of women in ancient Mesopotamian society. Now, Enheduanna is very interesting, but obviously she's a princess. She is far from typical. So, when you look at West in the World, be sure to be looking for that. What place did typical Mesopotamian women have in that society? Okay, well, we're going to keep on pushing forward in time to the old Babylonian Empire, which lasted roughly from 1800 to 1600 BCE. So we're still in we're going to be in Mesopotamia for this entire video, but we are specifically in the region of Babylon, which is not far from where, or the ancient city Babylon is not far from the modern city of Baghdad in Iraq. Here again, there is one king who stands head and shoulders over all the rest, and that is Hammurabi. And the reason why Hammurabi, Hammurabi, Abi, Hammurabi. The reason why he's so important is because of this incredibly well-preserved law code we have from Hammurabi. Now, do note, and this comes out in Western world, do note this is not the first written law code. Okay, it's not the first, but it's one of the earliest that we have, and it's very well preserved and sheds a lot of light on Mesopotamian society. So that's one question for you. Okay, what do you learn? What would someone learn about ancient Mesopotamian society by reading the laws in Hammurabi's code? Also pay attention to the artwork, the relief sculpture at the top of the Hammurabi monument. It's showing, it shows both the Babylonian god Shamash and also Hammurabi himself. So take a look at that, and then ask the question and answer the question. What does that image convey? What does it communicate about the power and authority of the Babylonian king, in this case Hammurabi? So be asking that. But I'll just, for now, leave it at this. That Hammurabi's code shows yet another use of writing. Writing which was not invented with the purpose of codifying law. That was not the original intent. But once you have writing, the Mesopotamians are going to find new uses for it. And one of those new uses is to codify law, which Hammurabi thought would work to the benefit of the downtrodden and oppressed people in society. And so think about that. Why would he say that? Why would he make that claim? Whether or not it's true, why would Hammurabi think that writing down the laws of the land would actually work to the benefit of people who are lower on the social scale? So consider that. Finally, we're almost done here. We're going to skip on to the first millennium BCE. And the first half of that millennium, so from roughly 1000 to 500 BCE, this is going to be a great age of empire building. This is largely due to a new hunger for iron. Okay? From about 3000 to 1200 BC, the preferred material for tools was bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin. So scholars will talk about the Bronze Age, and what they're talking about is the period from 3000 roughly to 1200 BC. But around the turn of the first millennium, there's a problem. Tin, which was needed to make bronze, was becoming increasingly scarce, and so people started to look for other kinds of materials for tools and weapons. And the Hittites, in particular, sort of pioneered a technique for forging iron, and it was widely adopted. And so you have all these different civilizations who are trying to get as much iron as they can, and then use that iron to help create a great empire. And one of the great Mesopotamian empire of this period, again, the first half of the first millennium BCE, the great Mesopotamian empire at this period is the Assyrian Empire, Assyrian, Assyrian Empire. Assyria is a region in northern Mesopotamia. And you'll read about them. I don't think I need to say a whole lot about them, except again just to say that this is another interesting place where ancient Near Eastern history and biblical history intersect, because it's the Assyrians who are going to bring about the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so if you've read those accounts in the Old Testament, you've encountered the Assyrians before. Finally, sorry, there's one more empire that I wanted to mention which sort of takes rise right in the middle of the first millennium BCE, and that is sometimes they're called the Neo-Babylonians. Sometimes they're called the Chaldeans, Chaldeans. Their most famous king was King Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not going to spell that out. I'm going to let you figure that out on your own. Nebuchadnezzar. If you've been to Vacation Bible School or Sunday school occasionally, you've probably heard the name Nebuchadnezzar, very famous Old Testament figure. I think the main reason to know something, for our purposes, the main reason to know something about the Neo-Babylonians is because we actually possess a good deal of their art. They produce some very impressive art, like the Ishtar Gate, which you'll find in Art Across Time, page 71. They were also made some pretty impressive scholarly accomplishments. There were great mathematicians and astronomers among the Neo-Babylonians, so a very impressive kind of culture. So this has been, a very quick romp through some of the most important empires and figures in ancient Mesopotamian history. I'll also just remind you that there is a handout that I have on Canvas. It's called Mesopotamia Through the Millennia, and it's meant to just kind of give you a sense of what developments are happening when in ancient Mesopotamia. So I hope it's helpful. If it's not helpful, you can ignore it, but do take a look at it. All right, thanks.